Hi all, so here's the second video. We're going to be focusing on this one, start to look at that first argument from McTaggart and start to consider the premises. So, as I've already said, you probably don't need this if you're watching this straight after the last one, but here is the McTaggart One, the argument: if time exists then changes must occur. If changes occur then positions in time must form a particular series, the A series, so we've got if P then Q, if Q then R. But the A series is contradictory, so not R, therefore not P. That was our argument. And we're focusing here on this first premise, the idea that if time exists then changes must occur. So time exists, we're going to be considering what that really means for McTaggart in due course. We're going to be focusing now on this idea of what does he mean by the idea of change. So what we want to do in analytical philosophy, and well, I just think it's the correct way to proceed whenever you've got any kind of philosophical question, or any question at all, in fact, is to get clear about the meanings of the terms involved. I mean, I often see people sort of say about analytic philosophy that there's a sense in which, well, I don't know, some people find it boring, or it seems to me, but it's like, well, that's because you'd think careful thought is boring then. Careful thought, picking apart arguments, looking at definitions, being clear about your terms. This is the only way in which clarity lies, and it's worth the effort because clarity is, well, it's an enjoyable state of mind to be in. So, let's have a think. What does it mean then to say that things change, or what is change? And we'll see, in fact, that McTaggart's idea of change it's controversial to begin with. So even premise one is a controversial idea, that if time exists then changes must occur. And we'll see there's a natural reading of this which is not McTaggart's reading. And in fact McTaggart even suggests this natural reading. So let's have a look at a quote from McTaggart. So it looks as though what he means by change is one thing, and it turns out he means something different. So let's have a look at what it looks like he means. So here's a quote. This is from the book, so it's clearer, the quote he gives from the book. There's a very similar passage in the 1908 article, but this is from his later, The Nature of Existence. So he says, it would, I suppose, be universally admitted that time involves change. In ordinary language, indeed, we say that something can remain unchanged through time, but there could be no time if nothing changed, and if anything changes, then all other things change with it. For its change must change some of their relations to it, and so their relational qualities. The fall of a sandcastle on the English coast changes the nature of the Great Pyramid. Okay, so the thing I want to pick out about this is this idea here of if anything changes, then all other things must change with it. For its change, so there he talks about sandcastle and the Great Pyramid. So here, anything, all of the things. So I'm emphasizing these things because things are objects, material objects. It looks as though he's talking about changing of material objects, and indeed here he's talking about a sandcastle and the Great Pyramid. So it looks as though what he means when he says if time exists changes must occur, it looks like what he means is, objects must change. If time exists, then objects must change. So I'm emphasizing this because it turns out that's not what he means at all. This is not really a very well put passage for what he wants to say. So let's now move back to my board, clear off this one, and okay. Let's think about this then. So, let's draw another timeline. They're getting a bit straighter. I'm getting used to this pad. Well, okay. Let's first of all consider the idea of an unchanging universe. So we might think of an unchanging universe as one in which objects never change. So let's just draw a simple arrangement of objects. Let's have a person. Let's make sure they're connected. So there we've got a person, and suppose there is a planet above them, and then, I don't know, some sort of a floating teacup up here. Doesn't really matter. And we've just got this arrangement of objects. So, and this is well, let's suppose this is at T1, T2, T3, T4, oops, and T5, okay. And the idea is, so these are meant to be separate times, right? We're drawing a timeline. And imagine at T2, the universe is in exactly the same state. So there we go. So we just got the same arrangement of objects, so these are meant to be identical in each of these instances. Okay, nothing changes, the planet above doesn't change its colour, the mug doesn't move, the person doesn't move, you know, we just get that repeated throughout time. So it's this weird universe that just contains a kind of static arrangement of objects. There the idea is, well look, no object changes. None of the objects change their properties, they don't change their relations to one another. There it looks like we've got a static universe, and there it looks like we've got a universe in which time doesn't flow. At least that's a plausible thing to say. Maybe you think that in order for time to flow, you need to have objects changing, and that's what constitutes the flow of time. But this isn't what McTaggart means. In fact, it turns out that McTaggart can actually allow that time does flow in this universe. And that might seem puzzling, because what's he talking about then? Oh, by the way, the idea of the change in one object causing a change in all the other. Well, let's now suppose, by the way, that this planet, so let's have a simple change, this planet starts off as being red, then switches its colour to blue somehow, and then switches its colour to green at these 3 times. Well, there the idea is, well, there we've got a change in the planet, right? But thereby, we can say that on the natural thought, we've got sort of time now flowing, because this now constitutes some sort of a change over time between the planets. So we've got, right, must be time for it to be occurring in. But also now we can say that even though this person remains static and doesn't move intrinsically, well, they're still undergoing a change, because well, here they have the property, or they stand in a relation of being, I don't know, whatever, 10,000 miles, I don't know how far away planets are, 10,000 miles from a red planet, then they've got the property of being 10,000 miles from a blue planet, and then 10,000 miles from a green planet. So in other words, the change in the planet gives a relational change to the human being. That seems to be what McTaggart's talking about when he's talking about the fall of the sandcastle changes the nature of the Great Pyramids. It's a relational change, but nonetheless it's something that we can say is different about the other objects. So okay, it really does look like, from that quote, that this is what McTaggart wants to say. That change must involve, for time to occur, it must involve objects changing their properties. But it's not. It's not. And the reason is, well, it turns out that this is precisely what Bertrand Russell's theory of change is, and McTaggart rejects Bertrand Russell's theory of change. So we'll keep our timeline and give Russell's example. Russell talks about a poker, so let's just put in Monday here, Tuesday here, so we just got 2 times, Wednesday, blah blah blah, but we're only going to need 2. Bertrand Russell says, well, imagine you've got a poker. His example is of a poker, you know, a thing you stoke a fire with. So we're going to have that on Monday and Tuesday. And he says the poker can be hot on Monday, there's the hot, and cold on Tuesday. And he says, and that's what it is for, the poker is thereby changed because it's got a certain set of properties. So Monday, poker is hot. Tuesday, poker is cold. So it's got one property on Monday, a different property on Tuesday. Well, therefore, change has occurred, right? So, in other words, he has something like, Bertrand Russell says, well, let's put it like this. Change is where an object has a property at one time and another property, or a different property, at another time, or a different time. So that's Bertrand Russell's account of change. What is it for change to occur? Well, it's simply for an object to have a property at one time and an object to have a different property at another time. That's what change is. And McTaggart says, no, this isn't what real change is. This isn't real change at all. And the reason is, McTaggart says, well, look, it's always the case that the poker is hot on Monday, and it's always the case. So, again, go back in time here, go back to just Sunday. Imagine you say the poker is hot or will be hot on Monday, and you could say on Wednesday the poker is hot on Monday, and you could say the poker is cold on Tuesday, and so on. His idea is this isn't real change because you don't get any change in the truth value of the propositions describing reality. The poker is just hot on Monday, it's cold on Tuesday. Those are timeless facts. They're like the B-theory facts. Here you are attributing a property to these, to the poker itself, but the property you ascribe to it is one that, being hot on Monday is something it has all the time, and being cold on Tuesday is something it has all the time as well. That's his idea. We can discuss whether this is coherent. I'm here just trying to outline his thought. The idea is, at any rate, this can't be what change is on McTaggart's view. Let's go back to the board a second. So, he seems like he wants to say change involves objects undergoing changes of their properties, right? He really does suggest that here. But then, when he considers Bertrand Russell's account, which says precisely that, he rejects it. So put it like this. This looks to be the principle that he endorses. I'm calling it change principle 1. So necessarily, if time exists, then some object undergoes change. That's what, naturally, having read that previous quote, you would think is McTaggart's view. And we can spell that out. What is it then for an object to undergo change? And this is the Bertrand Russell idea. So if we just think about object undergoing change as an object having one property at one time and a different property at a different time, then we can spell out CP1, the first change principle, in these terms. Necessarily, if time exists, then for some object x, x has property f at time t1, and it is not the case that x has f at time t2. So the poker example, the poker had the property of being hot on the Monday, and it didn't have that property on Tuesday, and that looks like what change is. But McTaggart rejects this. He says, no, this is not genuine change. So change isn't to do with objects changing their properties. Rather, he says this: if time exists, then it's not enough for objects to undergo change. Events themselves must undergo change. That's his idea. So remember, in the very first video, I distinguished between objects, properties, and event ontology. Here we've got McTaggart endorsing something like an event ontology here. We must think about events as the sort of fundamental things that undergo change. Okay? So, what does it mean? Well, let's go back to the drawing board once more and clear this off. Again, draw a timeline. Put the divisions in. So, World War II, World War I. Let's have a, I don't know, there's a plane. It's a plane. I can't draw. Anyway, it's a plane. Let's have our tank again. I quite like the tank, that was easy. And then let's have, some other event up here. Let's have, I don't know, I hate trying to think. World War I and 2 are easy. They're just events that easily come to mind. Let's have the Olympic Games. I'm going to come a cropper here. The Olympic, because I can't remember when the last Olympic Games was. Was there some in 2018? Let's suppose there was. So, the Olympic Games in 2018. Let's have somebody with a hammer. God, anyway, you get the idea. So World War One, we'll just put in a random date there, 1942 this time. And World War One, well, let's have 17. Keep it at that. Okay, so obviously in this world, the actual world, we're supposing, we've got objects changing their properties all the time. I mean, the change between 1917 and 1942, obviously people have moved around, people have died, other people have been born, things have been made, blah blah blah. I mean, there's obviously all the changes that go on all around us all the time are happening during these 2 years. The universe in 1942 is very different from the universe in 1917 in terms of the objects and the arrangement of them and so on. So we certainly have objects changing their properties, but McTaggart wants to say that's not enough to give us genuine change. Rather, what we've got to have is the events themselves, World War II and World War I and the Olympic Games. These things have got to undergo change. The events themselves must change. And the question is, well, okay, what properties do these events have? Well, World War II occurred between 1939 and 1945. So there's a property. It's got the property of occurring between these. Well, that never changes, right? That's just fixed. It's always, back in 1917 it was going to occur between 1939 and 1945. In 2018 it was going to occur between 1939. So that doesn't change. So how can events change? McTaggart's answer is, well, they change with regard to their A property. So it is past, right, from our perspective. In fact, all of these events are past from our perspective, right? But in this perspective it was future, so, this is the only way, he thinks, in which events can change. They change with regards to their A properties. So now you begin to see this idea. If time is to exist, it turns out events must change, says McTaggart. And how do they change? Well, they change with regards to their A properties. So, in order to get the flow of time, in order to get change occurring and time, we've got to have events organised in terms of the A series. In fact, I've sort of skipped to premise 2 a little bit. That's okay. So if we remember, not only have we got, these kind of come together, but we've got, if time exists, then changes must occur. Really here then he's talking about the idea that events must change. That's what he means when he says changes must occur. Events themselves have to change. Not enough for objects to change. And then we get the idea that they can only change with regards to their A properties, past, present and future. Therefore, we must be able to arrange time in terms of the A series. So I've really done premise 1 and 2 together here. So, okay. Hopefully this makes sense then. Necessarily, if time exists, then some event undergoes change. And therefore, he thinks the only way in which events can undergo change is regards to their A properties. So, one last thing that I'm going to say about this before quickly looking at some criticisms of this, or really one main criticism, is remember we started off with the idea that, imagine we've got what we might think of as a completely static universe. So I just separated things out. I had T1, T2, T3, T4, and I illustrated it with this, admittedly rather strange example of just things. I'm drawing it very quick, so bear in mind these are meant to be identical over time. I know they look like they're changing, but it's supposed to represent an unchanging universe, right? So we're imagining that nothing ever alters here, the things just don't change their properties and they remain in fixed relations. Now actually McTaggart can still allow that even though there's no objects changing in this universe, well, nonetheless, if we've got some sort of a flow of time, if indeed there's some sense in which at this point, well, what can we say is past? Maybe we can actually put times in here, 1910, 1920, 1930. He can allow, I'm not saying he would say that this is true, But it looks like he can allow that you might be able to say, or, I mean, they won't actually say anything, but you could say here 1910 is past, right? Even though there's no object changing, if we could still get some sort of a flow down here such that this would be true there, and then perhaps he can allow that even in a completely static universe you can still have change. Perhaps he wouldn't. Perhaps he wants to say, in order to be able to say that events are changing, you also need objects to change, right? Does that make sense? So he might want to be stronger and say, make a stronger claim and say, in order for events to change, in order to be able to attribute past, present and future to events, then you do still need objects to undergo change. You might want to say that. But the point being, it's not enough. It doesn't give you change merely if objects change their properties. He thinks you need something more. You need events changing their properties, and for that you need past, present and future. So okay, I hope that that's clear enough. Now, what's the criticism of this then? There's really one main criticism to the first premise, and by extension to the second premise. Let's put it up. So what's the objection? It's given by a number of people, and it's simply this. Hang on a minute. There's something dodgy about the idea that events change. We wouldn't ordinarily say that events change, would we? We don't want to say that World War II changes. I mean, don't we say objects change, things change? So, you know, we can say that Boris Johnson has changed since he took office, or we might say this table has changed since I bought it. I've painted it another colour. You know, we'd say things change. Do we really? Is that normal parlance to say that events change? And this is pressed by C.D. Broad, so we'll see his view. He was the first person to defend the growing block view of time. This is J.J.C. Smart. I mentioned him, I think, in the first video as being one of the first materialists. So he also wrote on the philosophy of time, the first physicalist, you know, identity theory of the mind he held. Also a utilitarian. He worked in a number of areas. Anyway, Arthur Pryor, the first modern-day presentist, and also Bertrand Russell as well. So each of these people basically made the same criticism. They want to say, normally we say that events occur or happen. So World War II occurred. We don't say that it occurred at one time and then it stopped occurring and so on. But we don't really normally say that World War II has changed. It seems an odd. So in other words, they basically just think that premise one, the problem with it, has got something to do with like a grammatical error, a kind of think of another way. So to talk about the idea that events change on this view is just to make something like a category error. So a category error is where you try to apply a particular type of property or a particular, so in this case the idea of change, to something that it doesn't correctly apply to. So you might think of this similar kind of an error as being, if we ask something like, what time is it on the sun? That's a Wittgenstein example. What time is it on the sun? If somebody says, it's not so much that the sentence is ungrammatical as such. It's just you're trying to apply the notion of there being a time to somewhere it doesn't make sense. It's like, well, time only exists on the planet to do with the time zone. It doesn't make sense to ask what time it is on the sun. So in a similar kind of a way, these people want to say it doesn't make sense to say that events change. It's literally you're trying to apply a concept to events that doesn't apply to them. And that is just to try to force through their view that change, and Russell's explicitly, that change involves objects shifting in their properties, having properties at one time and a different properties at another time. Yeah. So okay, I wonder what you make of that. That's really the main criticism. Many people respond and they think, well, okay, fine, there's a certain sense then perhaps in which we wouldn't ordinarily say that events change, but many people think McTaggart's onto something, this idea that to get a movement, to get a flow. Many people are, if we just take our board again and draw in some sort of a timeline again. Yeah, and if we imagine the universe is like this, and it's made up as we. So let's draw in. There's the plane. It's going to be even worse. There's our tank, and here's our Olympic Games that we had with the hammer. Okay, so the idea is meant to be that if the universe is like this, all laid out there, only arranged in terms of earlier and later than relation, so you can imagine some sort of, you can't really draw it, but imagine a God's-eye view. You can look down, oops, I don't know what's happened, there we go, on the timeline and see everything laid out before him. The thought, many people are persuaded by the idea that the universe is kind of static, that there's really no time there. So many people, and they think that is related to the idea of past, present and future. And so whether or not McTaggart is strictly saying something grammatical when he say that for change to occur it must involve events changing in terms of their A properties, whether or not that makes sense, strictly speaking, according to the way we ordinarily speak, there is something to this. They want to say time flowing involves the A series. So, at any rate, I wonder what you make of that. And that will do. We'll now move on to, in fact, what are we going to do next? We're going to move on, I think, to consider McTaggart 2, the second of these arguments, and try and bolster some of this. But okay, so far then, just to summarise where we are, I've laid out McTaggart 1, I've explained the structure of the argument, I've given what this A series is in contrast to the B series, about arranging things in terms of past, present and future. And then we've looked at these first two premises. We've established that if time exists, then changes must occur, where McTaggart understands that as in terms of changes in events, and therefore thinks that the only way in which events can change is in terms of their A properties. And that's where we are so far. Then we've looked at a criticism that says, does it make sense to say that events change? So that's where we are. Okay, let's move on to the next video. Thanks.